All right, we've got our next speaker lined up, ready to go. That speaker is Michael Jovel. He's an interactive developer who currently works on front-end web dev for the FDA in the US. Michael is extremely active in his local design communities. He organizes a conference called Be More Responsive in Baltimore. He's previously been a board member of AIGA Baltimore, and he's also spent some time as a college design instructor. Particularly interesting for me about Michael is the scale of some of the projects that he's worked on, and in the public sector as well, which has its own challenges. Obviously, currently working at the FDA, but he's previously served time as the interim chief of web for the US Navy and led a significant redesign of the Navy.mil site. So I can only begin to grapple with the scope of that project. Today, Michael is talking about building living style guides with Jekyll, and I'm excited to have Michael with us. Michael, you can jump on there. Oh, just unmute yourself.
Okay, sorry about that.
There we go.
Hey everybody, how's it going? My name is Michael, and sorry, let me share my screen. All right. So my talk, I'm basically talking about building a style guide using Jekyll. And before that, I know that there are probably a lot of front-end people here, so a lot of this may not be new ground. But I did want to give you kind of the opportunity for those who may not be as familiar with style guides and kind of what has led up to them. I wanted to kind of cover a little bit of that before getting into how the Jekyll ties in. All right, so the fun part about working with the government is that you get to throw these in. So I am an employee of the Food and Drug Administration in the United States, and the opinions expressed here are those of the presenter, me, and do not necessarily reflect the positions of the Food and Drug Administration. Prior to that, as you mentioned, I worked for the Department of Defense, primarily for the Navy and Air Force, during which time I led, as mentioned, a redesign of Navy.mil from at the time where it was, and I'm about to say a really dirty word in the web world of, as a Flash developer, I came in to basically, in the dying days of Flash, come in and try to salvage as much as could be with a site that was at that point run 90% on Flash. And I probably lost most of you already based on just saying, admitting to that. It's kind of like a war crime. And just so that you can see I was an employee of the Department of Defense, this is a real photo taken of me on my lunch break. So kind of diving right in, pretty much, and this has been a long battle. We've always had this illusion of control over, what the appearance of our sites or our apps look like to our users on a very individual pages, kind of like translating this idea of print to web, in which, kind of presenting these Photoshop mock-ups to the development team or to the client, and based on that, building out an app. And of course, midway through, figuring out that things didn't quite work as they did. And pretty much mobile was kind of like that final nail in the coffin that basically communicated and said, hey, the way we're doing things, we can no longer afford to be designing pages. We have to think of a new way to do things. When, as I mentioned, we never really had the control. We just kind of have been really good at building up these illusions of control. So one of the first iterations of this was a project by Samantha Warren called Style Tiles. Now this was still, heavily on the Photoshop, but it was more so allowing for some of the graphic assets and treatments to be communicated to a client without necessarily having to build out an entire app or system. And then we went, and Daniel Mall kind of took it one step further with element collages and this idea of basically being able to create small little snapshots of interactions without building out the entire system. All right, so basically, as you said, we're not designing pages anymore. We're designing systems of components. And that's a very key distinction in what we're doing. And really, one of the first people to really kind of clearly articulate this was the idea of atomic design, which was presented by Brad Frost. And through it, basically, we've always kind of devised a system or tried to devise a system of how do you create, websites and what are the actual pieces of it. We've always had this idea of, well, we have a page and then we have, that page might be driven by a template, but we've kind of, when we've had to move to mobile, we've had to get to a lot more granular level. And Brad kind of did a very good job of being able to tie this into something that we're all somewhat familiar with in this idea of science and atoms and molecules, and kind of trying to decide what pieces of a design or of interaction are more effective, and which one's more granular than the other. And you kind of look at this and you pretty much automatically have an idea of what the next bigger unit is, or the smaller one that make up that larger one. So just to kind of outline some of this, so basically atoms are the basic building blocks of matter. Applied to web interfaces, atoms are our HTML tags such as forms, labels, input buttons, individual lines of text, all of these very basic premises that all pages are built of and have hundreds of involved in them, and we tend to overlook them at the most granular level. Then when it comes to molecules, we start to, what happens when we start to combine those atoms. And in this case, we're looking at, for instance, a form label, a form being that next level of molecule. So we have, form labels, inputs, buttons, all these different things that can appear on a form, and there's kind of a cohesive unit, but tied together, they actually have a purpose, but it may not convey that larger, presentation of what each use case will be. Then organisms are basically, what happens when you tie a lot of these molecules. So, you have a search molecule, inside of the masthead, navigation. All of these things come together as one to form a piece that, once again, is still a smaller piece of a page, but is tied together with multiple smaller pieces. And then we have templates, which templates are pretty much almost as close as we get to pages, but it's more so tying all of these different pieces together to basically present specific types of content. It's not necessarily assigned to a specific page or a URL, but it is something like, for instance, a page with the intention of watching videos and commenting on and doing things like that. And then finally, we get down to the largest macro level of pages, which is basically we're taking those templates and we're implementing them as a whole. So what we get to with this idea, and Dave Rupert kind of outlined this very well, is this idea of basically creating basically tiny bootstraps for every client. So instead of presenting them with, once again, these Photoshop files or even code snippets or something like that, they basically have these actionable pieces which combine the presentation of what that molecule or element looks like with alongside of what code would take to implement it. And so once again, responsive deliverables should look a lot like functional Twitter Bootstrap style systems, custom tailored for each client's needs. And the advantages of these pattern libraries or style systems is basically, once again, that from a development side, it allows developers to spend more time or to more easily be able to prototype and create things, because basically they already have the guidelines for what smaller pieces should go into each of these components. So if they're not having to individually figure out what does a button look like on every single instance of it, it makes it a lot easier for them to be able to not worry about that. And from a designer side, it's once again, it's being able to focus in more so on what that experience looks like. All right, so once again, helps developers when prototyping. And this one is kind of a sticking point, especially in our agency right now, is that it helps basically content creators focus on creating content as opposed to what tags do what and what markup they need to do. A lot of times, we'll have, and we've had like in the past where, basically emailed code snippets go back and forth. Just to kind of divulge our content management system. One of it's an older system that's kind of grown, and so it revolves a lot around the idea of basically blobs of content. So we end up having to rely on the actual content creators to do a fairly reasonable job of understanding at least some of the basic markup within the system, and which oftentimes creates a lot of complications, especially when you're looking at adding some of the more complex functionality beyond just headings and text and images. So just to kind of get into a little bit of the semantics of some of there's a lot of obviously style guide generators have been created or creators, and they tend to take several different formats or types. The first one is what I would generally refer to as style parsers, probably most notably Nile style sheets or KSS is one of the more popular ones. And if you look at it, you'll see that basically the way it operates is it goes to basically the system it goes through, and during the compression, basically it will parse through and look at the structured comments that are there, and it will convert them to the comments that are involved and published inside of this documentation system. And there are other, like anything, there are a lot of other systems that follow very similar frameworks. So there is SC5, which the one distinction is that in SC5 you can actually go in and make live changes via browser. But for the most part, they all kind of suffer or have that same general approach. Also hologram. And basically the idea is that style with the style parsers is once again, and I guess the issue that I have most often with them, and generally the reason why I decided not to go in that direction, was that I didn't really like the idea of having my CSS or Sass basically littered with all of this extraneous markup for commenting. It just didn't seem like a very neat way of presenting. Now, obviously, it makes up for that in simplicity and being able to roll it out very quickly. But when I evaluated that, that was kind of the one thing that kind of had a drawback, in my opinion. Then we have static generators. Probably most popular one is Pattern Lab, which was once again Dave Olson along with Brad Frost. Basically created a system in which, via the layout, it basically automatically parses through the smaller files and basically generates the pattern library for you. And then probably one of the more popular, or probably the kind of the dream system for most people, tend to be dynamic style guide platforms. Probably most notably is Lonely Planet's system, Rizzo. And the nice thing about Rizzo is that basically their entire system, I believe, is Ruby driven, and basically the style guide itself is actually rendered from JSON files, if I remember correctly, that are output from the actual production system itself. So the nice thing about that is that this system should theoretically always reflect what is on on production. And Source.js is a new one, that very similar approach. But basically the one drawback with these, and truthfully this is where kind of I looked at these systems, and that we're currently in the process of evaluating new content management systems, and I didn't necessarily want it tied into the system, knowing that we would be shifting. In addition to that, I also just to kind of divulge a little bit about it, the way our system's set up is actually within FDA, the front end development team is actually in a different location from the general back end development team. So a lot of times we don't have full access to the system. So I wanted something that was removed enough from the system so that we could modify it and still distribute it fairly easily, and with the intention of ultimately using GitHub Pages to be able to distribute it around the agency. So some examples of nice style guides that I've seen recently. Code for America is one that I've noticed, a very well done. Salesforce, and within government, CFPB, which also I believe uses Jekyll, although they use a slightly different approach than what I did. And also, just if you're interested in style guides in general, I would recommend styleguides.io. It's a great resource for just general style guides. They give examples, podcasts, book recommendations. As you're studying up on style guides, I would definitely recommend you look at that. But with that, I'm going to go ahead and we're going to go into Hide, which is the name that I have dubbed the system that I'm working on right now with FDA. And basically, the idea behind it, and really why I named it Hide. I know that there was a fork of Jekyll at one point that was called Hide. That I'm not sure how active it is now, but basically, I like the idea of Hide because I kind of saw Hide, within the story of Jekyll and Hyde. Hyde was obviously kind of the allowed the ability for Dr. Jekyll to escape and kind of not the norms of society. And in this case, Hyde is kind of allowing us to kind of escape from a lot of the complications of being able to communicate style guides or styles within our agency and liberate us to kind of build new functionality as opposed to explaining old functionality. But to get into the origins of the style guide, it really starts with this, and this is something that one of my coworkers started, which basically was a PDF version of a style guide that was distributed that is distributed throughout FDA. Just as any typical style guide, it contains description of different markup, things that we want them to do, things that we don't want them to do, and really the main customer for this are content creators, those who have a very, very basic understanding of HTML. But the one problem that this system causes is that, one, it requires someone to update the InDesign file and then publish the PDFs and distribute. Trying to make sure that whatever the most recent changes are what's in people's hands, can often get very complicated. Not to mention just being able to cut and paste or if that is what they deem appropriate, is something that is nearly impossible here. I guess they could probably cut and paste from the PDF, although that obviously adds a lot of spacing issues and whatnot. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and open up Hide. So this is a very basic implementation of Hide, and you can basically see that, there's no navigation on it currently, but basically all it is, and it's the most basic pattern library that could exist. We have colors, and then they're divided within main colors, and for some reason I accidentally added that, so ignore that. You didn't see that, everybody. So then we have very basic explanations of some of the typography and what it would look like, as well as the code field that basically shows what that markup looks like should they choose to do it. And one of the pieces of functionality that we wanted as well is the ability to be able to share. If someone asks, oh, well, how do I create, and no, I would hope they would never ask, how do I create a heading? But instead of emailing them the general style guide, we would be able to send them a link to an individual page, which would then they would be able to see specifically addresses their needs. So we go through, and you'll see once again, we basically it follows the pattern of the name of the component, a description of the component, an example of what the component looks like in production, and then what the code looks like, and then a link to the page. And it goes on through, and we basically start off with the most basic elements, and we carry on, and we go to things. Once again, some basic things like jump links, which, although very simple, oftentimes we still find some of the old anchor or the name and all of that stuff, and so we want to document that. Call outs, buttons, button sizes, form buttons. In our case, we use a Gov Delivery, which is an email platform that for email newsletters, and we give basically two instances of what that looks like. One is the main content area, and then another one is the sidebar or a side, and then accordions, and once again, all fully functioning. And then just an explanation of how the aside works in our setup as well as code, and then we go into our media elements and data tables, which believe it or not, we still from time to time find table-based layouts, which is why we add several notes telling them not to do that. But once again, basically combining that visual example of what the system looks like along with actual implementations. So if we pull up the actual code, you'll see that basically what we're working on, and we're looking at the configuration file. You'll see that right now we have two different collections. We have one for colors and patterns. I knew when I first started to create this, I actually used a mechanism of using pages and includes, and it got very, very complicated very, very quickly. And then I was fortunate enough to figure out collections, and that has kind of been a godsend. And but even then, I've been conflicted with this idea of how do you separate, what's the best way to separate out some of these patterns. And it was less about, when is it, what's cleaner for the development. It was almost more so what's something that is more workable for someone else to submit. And so I separated out colors and patterns to start out with, and you'll see that within colors, I have basically, declared layout of color, and then I have the two types of color. I basically have main color, which is the primary colors, and then secondary colors, and then I have just listed out, whatever the hexadecimal number is. At this point, we don't use SAS, although it's something that I think with the rollout of the new system, I'm strongly pushing for to clean up our markup. So as for right now, we've simplified and just listed out hexadecimal numbers. And so you could see that, generally this is how the color framework was. And once again, the reason why I separated these out was more so because I wanted something that was fairly easy to add and subtract from. And I felt like if everything was kind of a component, then we would run into this idea of, okay, well, now I have, a jillion files inside of this directory, and I have to search for, whatever I need to modify. So I really wanted something that was very simple and allowed for it. And I'm strongly considering just, separating out a lot of the components from the way they're set up currently, which I have a type for in as well. So to avoid kind of that feeling of being overwhelmed by different components. So inside of patterns, we'll go to say delivery, and you can see that once again I basically have layout type, which in this case I've just declared it a general component, which to be somewhat of a cop-out was just kind of I don't really know how to classify this at this moment. So I wanted to keep a lot of the kind of generals together. And then title, which is obviously used to generate the page titles and navigation links as well. And then description, which is the basic description of what that component does. And then in the content, I basically have the actual code snippet of what that specific component does. And you can see that if I were to go to, let's say, YouTube, you'll see that in this case, obviously, I have type media. And that, once again, just I wanted to keep things semi-clean. And I'm still considering, like I said, separating a lot of those out so that each major component area is its own collection. So now if we were to go ahead and let's go into our pattern, and this is still pretty ugly from a layout perspective, but it does what it intends to. So in this case, basically, once again, I basically have my div colors, and then inside of that, I basically run a for loop, and inside of that, I have I only basically am pulling out anything that has the type of main color and displaying those, and then secondary color as well. And then I'm just basically going through and repeating this process, which is obviously why I say it's messy. I could go through and clean a lot of that up. But ideally, what I'm trying to do is basically automate a lot of those processes that I would normally have to go through to accomplish this. And then we basically have, header. So inside of my header, I'm calling through a couple of style sheets that we have. And then for the ones that actually drive the presentation itself of like a lot of the swatches and stuff like that, for now I decided to keep those inline because I just wanted to, or not inline, but as an embedded style sheet. Because I wanted to have them kind of separate from a lot of the other markup, and I didn't really want to import another CSS file for some very basic things like that I didn't want necessarily going into production. So from here, I basically, inside of pattern, and this obviously is the layout that makes up the pattern pages. You can see, once again, display the title inside of an H1, page description inside a paragraph, and then display the content. And then I have inside of the highlight so that it displays the code block, I have the content. As well here, so that in this instance it's basically showing them the exact same markup that it's taking to generate the pages themselves. And I think that, and so that's the basics of the system. And once again, this is still in its infancy. The general idea, once again, was being able to create something that, one, didn't require any back-end system so that we could very easily distribute it and not necessarily, or not risk too much from not getting it approved. And also it was being Jekyll was something I was familiar with, more so from the blog framework, and that's but that's pretty much it. So I guess I will go ahead and come in and we can start some questions.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Michael. I know the first one for me is you mentioned the a focus on the ease of contributions by others. I mean, how many people are working on this style guide with you at the moment?
Currently, it's just two, but we're planning on opening it up to a lot more. We're as with most government agencies, we're always optimistic of getting more staffing and support, and also trying to bridge that gap, because as I mentioned, with our development team being in a different department, or the back-end development team being in a different department, kind of trying to bridge that gap and say, hey, here's this system that we have, and you can add to it, and it's very simple.
Is that working for you? Is it helping the communication between a team that's located physically somewhere else? Is it a good sort of stepping stone to better communications?
It is a good start. I think we're realizing a lot of the shortfalls, and I think, like I said, ease of contribution right now was one of them. I think also what I'm trying to aim for in general with the project is allow it to be something that is fully open source and easier to kind of distribute, and someone to get out of the box and have a pretty good understanding, similar to an Octopress, or the ability to just kind of build your own style guide with minimal instruction is in the long run kind of the goal of the system.
Cool. You mentioned you tried to make it as a smaller step as possible, so that to minimize the chance of not getting approved, which I appreciate is a constant battle in some agencies and in some companies. I mean, do you have any? If anyone else wants to sell Jekyll into their organization, do you have any tips for them with dealing with other stakeholders?
In general, I would say the nice thing about Jekyll for us has been it requires the least permission, especially with, like I said, with generating static HTML or to GitHub pages. It doesn't require as much of of a requisition of a bunch of paperwork for technology. It's something that we already have. So I think that was kind of the main focus, is the main focus of decisions from a authorization standpoint.
Great. There's been a bit of a common theme today about, particularly going back to Ben Bolter's talk, where we're talking about letting people focus on the content. And has this hit your content creators yet, or is it still being in the creation phase?
I think we're still in the general creation phase, and like I said, I think a lot of it has to do with the nature of the content management system we're using currently, which is, or the way it had been set up, and it's one of those monstrosities that's been around for a very long time. So because of that blob nature of the big giant content field, and having markup in the field, there's a lot of intimidation from just focusing on the content. So people spend so much time worrying about what the code for an accordion looks like, or what how to embed a form in their content, or a video, that that it's been hard to get them there. But I think, like I said, this is a very important first step for us.
Cool. Great answer. Question here off the Twitter stream from Paul Lloyd. He asks, have you considered using the data folder for certain elements of your style guide, like colors, typography, things like that?
I had, and to be honest, part of that came down to consistency of expectation for contribution. That we just wanted it to be a very go here, do this setup, where I feel like if you're trying to explain multiple mechanisms it can quickly get complicated. It's not something that I necessarily am writing off, but for now, I think this, for contribution's sake, this is probably the simplest setup we can have.
Yep. Cool. Another question here. What do you think are the barriers for an organization to adopt a living style guide over, traditional printed ones?
Sorry, you said the barriers?
Yeah, I mean, what do you think are some of the barriers for an organization that wants to move towards these living style guides, but maybe tied technology-wise or cultural, like organizationally cultural-wise, to the printed guides that they currently use?
Gotcha. I don't know, to be honest with you. I mean, so far I've found it to be very refreshing for the people I've seen use them, in that it's once again a matter of sending a URL if you need to send a URL. Cuts your email, cuts front end development email time a lot. But I mean, I think for those, it's more so from the creators. You have to, obviously, some of the people who are producing these style guides for for print, might not necessarily be trained in front end web. So I think it's more so kind of breaking that barrier than it is really from a stakeholder's perspective, because it's something that's pretty straightforward. Kind of, if you have a basic understanding.
Cool. Right, I don't have any more questions for you from our side or from the Twitter stream at the moment. So if you've got any closing comments, I would love to hear those now.
Cool. Well, thank you very much for having me. I've enjoyed the conference a lot. If you guys have any questions, I'll be on Twitter for a while. My 3 children are out with my wife, so I've had the house to myself. And I'm Jovel on Twitter. And shout out if you guys have any thoughts or anything too, questions. I'm willing to talk about it. So yeah, thanks.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Michael. It's been a pleasure to have you here.